Hi, everyone. Welcome back. We hope you enjoyed the lunch. Or if you're just joining us now, welcome. I'm Margot Treadwell. So first, I'm excited to kick off the rest of our event. We have an exciting panel after this on youth in Africa, and we'll conclude our day with a keynote speaker, Jake Sullivan. But first, I am very excited to announce our second panel, Foreign Policy for Modern Audiences, moderated by Jane Darby-Menton, a fellow in the Nuclear Policy Program at Carnegie and director of the Carnegie International Nuclear Policy Conference. She'll be moderating a discussion with Dave Lawler, Fergus Shiel, and Josh Keating.
All right, well, thanks so much, and thank you all for being here today. I'm really excited to be moderating this conversation about sort of the challenges and opportunities that come with trying to communicate ideas and talk about foreign policy in the modern world, which is a world that feels, saturated, if not oversaturated, with at least noise, if not news. And also, I think for a lot of us, we see this as integral to our work. We recognize that it's really important to do. But the pathways for doing it effectively are increasingly difficult to find, and sometimes it feels like that ball is moving really quickly. And so this is, I think, a really great opportunity to talk to the three of you about your experiences navigating that ecosystem, and to sort of flip the tables a little bit and to get to ask questions to people who tend to be the ones asking questions. I'm also delighted because personally, I started my career as a journalist, and I like to kind of think of myself as a journalist in remission. And so I think this is a really cool conversation we're going to get to have right now. So just the way it's going to work, so we're going to have a moderated conversation up here for a bit, and then we'll turn over to the audience for Q&A. That'll be about 20 minutes, and there should be mics in the room. All right, so just to briefly give a little bit of a longer introduction to the three of you and then turn it over to some questions. Dave Lawler is the deputy managing editor at Axios, where he oversees coverage of national security and US foreign policy. You've probably seen his name in your inbox and newsletters. Josh Keating is the senior correspondent at Vox, covering foreign policy and world news with a focus on the future of international conflict. And Fergus Shiel is managing editor at the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, where he's overseen multiple prize-winning investigations, including things like the Pandora Papers and the Benson files. So this is a really exciting panel, not only because y'all are working on really important things, but I think you're also coming at it from slightly different angles, and so I think we're gonna get into some of that next. So to kick things off, I wanted to ask a question to the three of you. I think that, the way we frame questions about communication right now are often, we start with the challenges, and I think we're gonna get into a lot of that as well. But I wanna maybe try to at least kick us off on a slightly more optimistic note. So this is the Junior Fellows Conference. We have fantastic junior fellows at Carnegie who are doing really good work, and they really I think they're optimistic and excited about trying to figure out how to communicate that more broadly. So what would you see as some of the opportunities for communicating, especially for younger people in this space? And what do you think people should be doing if that's something that they want to incorporate into their work?
Sure, I'll make a couple points. You guys might have more fulsome answers than me. I think one of the advantages to being young in any field is that you're not as beholden to the sort of traditions and strictures of the way you do the job as the people who have been doing it for a longer time. I mean, I became a full-time journalist in kind of the period where Twitter was emerging as a major force in international news, and those of us, I'm not a big poster, so I didn't build a massive brand for myself as some did on Twitter, but I certainly could use Twitter as a news gathering tool in a way that was very helpful at that time. I won't even pretend to know where the conversation is happening now, even let alone in 5 or 10 years. But I think the adaptability that comes with being open to new forms of gathering information and presenting it rather than, I started on a broadsheet newspaper where getting your name in print was the biggest goal out there, and then we sort of ignored the fact that very, very few people were ever seeing it in print over time. And so I think there's certainly opportunities there to not just say, oh, this person who's 10 years more senior than me does their job this way, therefore I will do it my job this way. I mean, you can certainly learn from older colleagues, but not being afraid to use your competitive advantage in the sense of just being more fluent with new forms of communication.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks, Jane Darby, and thanks to Carnegie for hosting us. It's funny, this is kind of like a little homecoming for me, because my career started in this building when I worked at Foreign Policy magazine, FP, which at the time, for about 20 years or so, I think was published by the Carnegie Endowment. And so I started here and then was acquired by the Post shortly after it. But I sort of liked being at the nexus of those two worlds, working for a media organization that sort of had one foot in a think tank but was also very consciously trying to build a larger audience and not trying to just communicate to the people who work in this building or the two buildings down the street, but to the general public. And I totally agree with what Dave said. I mean, when I remember starting out like blogs, just the ability to like write, having an informal voice and writing in first person, and that kind of style was like very hot at that time. And it was definitely like an area of opportunity if you were sort of younger and hadn't been around quite as long. And so that's an advantage. And also, I just think a big part of what our role is sort of letting different audiences in on the conversation that other groups are having. I think like right now the information ecosystem is so siloed, and often it's people just having conversations with each other. So I think, but for me, it's like, what is the sort of policymaking community in DC talking about that the wider public isn't aware of, that would be interested in? So that's where I see my role. But there's all kinds of conversations happening that just consume small groups of people that people outside those groups would be interested in. So it's I think there are just so many opportunities to let people in on those conversations.
I work for a tiny organization. It's only about a couple of blocks from here. And we have done, I think, 5 of the biggest projects in history. And the reason we've been able to do it is something that you can all do. So you, because you're young, are tech savvy. You have to be tech savvy to do this. The other thing is you have to be collaborative. So you all have lots of friends, and you will go on to have lots of friends. As you get older, you'll have fewer friends. So you can collaborate. You can use technology, and you're also the most international generation in history. And to tackle systemic problems now, you need the radical embrace of technology. You need to be collaborative, and you need to be international, because so many of our problems now are systemic, global, and the problems that occur in this city may have their genesis in another city or another country. And so I think you are at the cusp. You're poised to be able to do wonderful things. So there's massive grounds for optimism.
Yeah, I want to kind of pick up on that and ask you a little bit more about some of these huge undertakings that you've done. So I think that, if you are a researcher or even just a person right now, one of the biggest sort of things to think about is like, how do you take reams of information and like parse it in a reasonable way? And I think that the types of investigations you've worked on are a really interesting case study for this. So I think, what was it, the Pandora Papers was like 12 million documents or something?
Yeah, so Pandora Papers, 11.9 million documents, and it was from 14 offshore companies, and we worked on it for 2 years. And how do you do that? Well, you can't do it alone, because that's more documents than will fit in a university library. So what you do, so when you next go to do it, is you deploy technology. So we have technology that allows us to store, index, and translate documents. That's a really helpful piece of technology. We have a second piece of technology at ICIJ, which is a virtual newsroom, which is a bit like Facebook, where reporters can work around the clock and can fish in that lagoon of documents for 24/7. And through that collaboration, going back to collaboration is so essential because it overcomes the tyranny of distance, it overcomes the tyranny of language, it overcomes the tyranny of misunderstanding. So with collaboration, with technology, with hard work, amazing things can be achieved. And as a consequence of the Pandora Papers, we uncovered the offshore wealth, the hidden financial secrets of more than 100 billionaires, more than 300 politicians. We embraced 600 reporters from 170 countries, and we were able to do all of that from a tiny office, which at that stage didn't have a sink, here in DC. And as a consequence of that, many reforms flowed, and we were able to rock the world.
That sounds very efficient, I might argue. Okay, so a question for Josh and Dave. So a kind of, it seems like there's, we talk about journalism in general, but there's different versions of this. So these like long investigative projects, but the two of you are sort of in a slightly different position right now where you're having to respond to a lot of things that are breaking really quickly. And so I wanted to ask you a little bit about how you are thinking about sort of making quick choices when so many things are going on. How do you make decisions about priorities, what you're going to write about, what you're going to assign? What does that process look like for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like the eternal dilemma, and you never quite get the balance right. At every job I've had, it's always been like, how much do I respond to breaking news, and how, because that does come at the expense of longer-term reporting projects. I think the way an editor I work with put it, she said you should always have like a 3-day story and a 3-week story and a 3-month story, like going at any given time. At some places you have a 3-hour story or a 3-minute story. Like thankfully, I'm not in a job where I'm doing that quite right now. But there's different roles. I mean, like breaking news coverage is really important, but I've tended toward work that's more kind of analysis driven, and so I like kind of the second, third day stories where you take a step back and consider the larger consequences of an event that happened, an undercovered angle of it that other people aren't talking about. If you're not going to be the first one to report it, you should have like something more interesting to say about it than other people have. And so I think like the longer you get time-wise from what you're writing about, the more the premium on originality and approach goes up.
Yeah, I think we've answered this in the right order because Fergus was talking about 2 years investigations. Josh, I think, is a master of this happened this week, here's how you should think about it kind of story that contextualizes the day one news. And I am just coming off 2 years of running Axios's web coverage, including breaking news during the 2024 election, et cetera. And so like extremely quick fuse, thing happens, get a story out the door, ideally with a bit of reporting and context, but sometimes get the story up and then add that after the fact. I mean, it's like just different demands depending on what part of the media ecosystem you're in now. But there is the question, and I think this happens in all, if you're communicating information, there's this dilemma of you first have the nugget of something. Do you put that initial piece of information out, or do you build, for us, additional sources, more context, more information, until you have a more comprehensive story? Axios tends to be, we have kind of a scooplet culture where we will, I edit a guy named Barak Ravid, who some of you may have seen his work, and he tends to drive other journalists in town nuts because they've been working on something for a while, and he will just grab the key nugget of information that he's heard from sources, get it out into the world, and then all of a sudden they throw their hands up because they've been reporting this story, and so the pace of it can differ. But we also do sometimes, we had a story this morning that wasn't particularly earth-shattering, but about processes within the DNI's office on things that we, sort of took a few extra days to make sure that, because I'm not familiar with processes in the ODNI in particular. So like, okay, it will be embarrassing if we have a bit of a scoop, but if we put it out and one aspect of information is wrong, the intended audience will not pay attention to everything else we've put in this document. So buttoning that up as much as possible. But yes, certainly depending where you are in the media, the demands on immediately responding to news versus sitting with it for a while will depend quite a bit. Will differ quite a bit, rather.
Yeah, that kind of sets me up nicely for the next. I think that there's, the question of time horizons and what that means. Another, I think increasingly interesting question now is the medium question itself. So like the extent to which the medium is the message and how that then affects it. And all three of you, I think, have touched on that in slightly different ways. So, the way you communicate via a newsletter, which, Axios is so good at. You've also worked on podcasts. You've also written books. And then, ICIJ, you put out a lot of different types of products of different levels. I'd love to ask y'all a little bit about how to tell the most effective stories in the medium you're using. How do you think about where those matches lie?
I think it's changing really quickly. For example, like I'm a big podcast listener, and every once in a while I'll listen to a podcast episode and then realize at the end, 5 years ago that would have been a magazine piece, probably. Like they have the architecture of a lot of different angles of reporting. They're profiling someone, whatever the case may be, and that would just not have been something. I mean, reported podcasts have been around for a little while, but like. People are taking the tools that we all need to have in terms of building a story, knowing when you've got it down solidly, but distributing it in ways that we wouldn't even have thought of 5 or 10 years ago. For us, we're known for newsletters in particular. When I joined Axios in 2017, I kind of thought, okay, we'll ride this email newsletter wave for a couple of years, but I think it's probably I think we've reached peak newsletter, and turns out we hadn't. It's still been a phenomenon that is quite effective because you're hitting people where they are. Everybody scrolls their inbox every day, and you're going to see something directly from us rather than you having to think, I wonder what Axios is reporting today. We're going to tell you in your inbox. So that's an effective, surprisingly effective tool in as you mentioned, a media ecosystem that is it's just there's so many different ways that you can absorb information, and there's very few places that are reaching audiences at scale in the ways that the nightly news did a generation ago, or even the biggest newspapers in the country did. When I was getting into journalism. So I think people are getting more creative with trying to find audiences where they are, whether it's in podcasts or in their inbox, because you just can't depend on the fact that people will come find your stuff. It's pretty difficult.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that comes to mind for me when it comes to time horizons is I did have an opportunity a few years ago to write a book, and it was really a sort of mental struggle in a way too, because it's a book that dealt with sort of ongoing recent events, and so I turned it in, and when I turn in a magazine piece at the places I've worked, my expectations were at most it'll be up in a few days, like usually. It'll be up the next day or in a few hours. And the idea that I was just going to have to sit there for months as events in the world continued happening while I couldn't address them. I think I was driving my editor crazy after a while, like calling her, asking if I could make updates to it. Like if it were up to me, I would have been like changing things up until the night before. And so it's, both have their place, but I'd say you have to like sort of adjust your thinking and the way you kind of operate in time in order to sort of change formats like that.
ICIJ's approach is different. We think about it differently. So what we do essentially is solve giant puzzles all at the same time. So we do multiple puzzles in multiple countries over years. And so to amplify our solutions, or to improve our solutions, we work with reporters around the world. But then to share our findings, we do something different. So I'll give you a small example. This is a tiny example. So we famously did a story about Nike, and we went to shops all around Europe, and we bought Nike sneakers, and we wondered where they were taxed. And then we discovered that the sneakers in London and Paris and all went to the Netherlands, and that was tax point number one, but in fact they weren't paying much tax in the Netherlands. It was going off to a tiny office in Hamilton in Bermuda, and they were all paying their tax through this, which meant that Nike was paying very little tax because of the swoosh on the Nike runners. The swoosh on the runners was a royalty payment which reduced the tax in Europe, okay? So what you have there already is multiple countries doing the same stories about the same runners, and here's the thing. So as a tiny bird on the back of a water buffalo, because that is what ICIJ is, we are working with the global media, and they can all do that story at the same time. They can all do the same story at the same time because we all love Nike runners. We all have Nike runners. Our kids have Nike runners. Our parents have Nike runners. And we can put the story out at the same time. So we have a website. We have a really wonderful web team. We also have a social media team who are great, and they work tirelessly. But our solution to amplifying our message is to publish at the same time all around the world with multiple partners. And the reason that we can do that, the reason why that's important is because Nike is a very big company. If Nike is annoyed, it has a lot of lawyers, and Nike is one of the good guys. If you're dealing with kleptocrats and narco-traffickers and Ponzi schemers, they are not nice people. And by publishing at the same time in multiple countries, you provide protection against legal suits, you provide protection against threats, you provide protection against assault, in legislative assault, and that is why we publish in the way we do. The work that Axios and Vox does is amazing, like unbelievable. The speed, the alacrity that they do their work is incredible. I'm in awe of it. But our type of news is slow news with big impact.
Yeah, I think this is really interesting because I think it also touches on, in sort of the think tank world, and especially at a global think tank like Carnegie, we touch on bits of this in different ways. And one of them is that the stakes for going after powerful people can be different in different places. And so I kind of, two questions out of that. One is, how do you navigate the fact that, like, again, maybe that's changing, but like, you run real risks sometimes when you go after these big stories. How do you navigate that, and how, sort of as you're managing a team of people who might be in more hostile contexts, are you thinking about some of those balances? And then kind of a question for all three of you. We've been talking a lot about what it's like to communicate as a journalist, but people in this room also might be trying to communicate with you as a means of communicating. And so I'm curious if you could maybe say, what version of that interaction do you think is mutually beneficial? Or like when you're doing some of this work, where can people who are maybe more on the research side but are still tackling global questions or questions that are in the moment, how do we engage more effectively with the type of work y'all are doing?
I'll start with the first question, but I think that Fergus, I think, would probably have a higher stakes perspective on this than me, because we day to day navigate the fact that the White House press office is not happy with stuff that we are going to be reporting, but it's the stakes have raised significantly. Obviously, some outlets don't have the same access that they had previously. But for us, for the most part, it's, you get an angry email. Actually, one of the big questions is, what do you do if they say your story's wrong, but you still think it's right, right? Do you run the story with the denial? The White House says this isn't true, which we've done, multiple times. But in some ways, that dynamic has changed. I will say the Biden operation wasn't the easiest to work with for journalists in some ways too. I think to some regard they were more affronted by critical journalism than the Trump people, who are very accustomed to it at this point. And so we got really strong pushback on stories from the Biden folks that we didn't think were at the level of they sort of or were as even controversial as they probably thought that they were. But that's not battling it out in the courts, which I think is a different battle, which fortunately I haven't been directly involved in litigation over my reporting, thankfully. So I'm sure ICIJ has had to worry about that with just about every big story that you guys publish. But people have megaphones. People who have big megaphones and don't want scrutiny certainly have just as big, sometimes the punch back is louder than our initial punch, which can actually help get the story out in some ways. But how do you contend with that? I guess it's for the most part, you just have to be willing to continue to put the stories out there, even if you know it's going to ruffle a couple of feathers. But yeah, you guys may have more experience with that than I do.
So we're all in the same business. We are. So we're in the business of truth. At its core, that's what we're in. Okay, and at the moment, there's a do or die battle in the world over truth. Truth really matters. Like, it matters. It's essential. It is why journalists do what they do. Okay, and if you can't defend truth, the democracy collapses. So this is where we're at right now. And so what Dave and Josh do is so important, because it's instant truth. It's instant truth, and it immediately counters the counter narrative. Okay, what we do is long-term truth. So the consequences of long-term truth can be much graver than those for instant truth. That is the reality. And so for our partners in Russia, at the end of Pandora Papers, they all had to leave. So 16 out of 17 reporters left because it was unsafe. The 17th stayed because his baby didn't have a passport, so he couldn't leave, so we were worried about that. Our partner, I've had a partner in Benin that's gone to jail. One of our guys went to Equatorial Guinea the other day and ended up in police custody for a while. So Venezuela, there's hardly any reporters left. They're all out of Venezuela. Costa Rica has all the Nicaraguans. So all around the world, including in my own country in Ireland, there are really grim situations for reporters. There's death threats, there's Pegasus, which is a way of tracking reporters. So the advantage that we have at ICIJ is by publishing together. It goes back to the earlier thing. By publishing together, you defend against attack. Because, again, the strongest suit we have is truth. And in order to guarantee that everything we say in our stories is true, we have 3 fact checkers, 2 full-time, and what they do is that we go through every single story, and we footnote every word of every story down to the point of, does such and such have a beard? Is their car blue? What's their dog's name? And it will not get published by ICIJ if we say somebody has a beard when they have mutton chops. It won't get published. And the reason we do that is because that is our strongest defense, because when we publish our stories, there are a phalanx of lawyers who will come after us. Sometimes as many as 3 or 4 lawyers for one person sending us letters. And the people that are paying these lawyers have boundless resources, often stolen resources, sometimes billions of dollars that they have stolen, and they can afford these lawyers. And that's a separate issue altogether about the ethics of lawyers and accountants and money managers, who are not my favorite people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's so fantastic. There are organizations like ICIJ that have that sort of rigor, and it's increasingly rare to find that across the media. Like, more and more publications don't have copy desks, for instance.
Yeah.
They're just putting things online, and then if there's an error, they'll correct it after publication. There's definitely less fact-checking happening, and it's also, I think there is going to counter a little what I said earlier, but I think the move to podcasting and audio and sort of visual formats definitely kind of makes fact-checking not impossible, but like more difficult when there's not always a written record, and there's when officials are making their statements on in the midst of 3-hour podcasts with a former MMA fighter or something, as opposed to like an article in Foreign Affairs. Like, it's they're both ways to get your message out. One's like a little requires a little more of a lift to sort of go through and fact check. And I think that just not to sound too pessimistic, but just there's less of a premium on that kind of rigor and being like extremely cautious and just sort of less fact checking of public figures happening, and as a consequence, I think like a lot more people are just sort of accepting any form of journalism they hear as opinion. I think that there are fewer and fewer outlets people sort of depend on as sort of trusted neutral voices, as opposed to, you know, that's what they're just saying that because they hate the president or because they're trying to defend him. Or.
Yeah, I think, again, I think a lot of the JFs probably have been asked to fact check something, I would say that, like, you know, I started my career in journalism, and at least at the time, the first thing you did in an entry-level journalism job is you had to fact check. And I stand by, the older I get and the grumpier I become, the more I'm like, that is the most useful thing that anyone ever forced me to do. Because you see, and I remember at one point very early in my career, catching an error by someone very senior. And it was like a big, big error. And it was someone who really knew their stuff. They were smart. I don't think it was in bad faith. I've seen some bad faith ones too. But that was really humbling. And I think it's something that I think about now, which is like, always, always, always check yourself, and that reminder to be careful and to be skeptical. And so I think that that's, you know, it is both scary, as you say, that that's happening less and less. And that also affects, I think, the way we should view what we're consuming, even from reputable sources. But it is also, you know, a big thing. So I think kind of going back to it, you know, like people in the research space, we still have a little bit more luxury for that. We you know, people who are trying to craft careers as experts, maybe, you know, that's something that we can still do and probably should be doing. So again, kind of getting back to the question that I very inelegantly threw in there, you know, is that a place where maybe there's a valuable form of interaction between people who have a little bit more luxury to be underscoring those facts the time and time again when we're engaging with people who are sort of just by nature of what you're doing, sometimes you got to get things out more quickly.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say it's definitely a truism in journalism, and I assume in think tank world or wherever you end up that people will remember the one mistake you made longer than the 10 things that you got right. And when I joined Axios, we were only a couple weeks old, and that was definitely, you know, the idea was out there that if we got one big one wrong very early on when nobody knew what the heck Axios was, that was going to be, you know, potentially fatal to the you know, growth of the organization. So I you know, but the problem, and I was thinking about this when Josh was talking, is that a lot of the attacks that you will see will not be on the basis of the facts. It won't be people going line by line and like annotating, oh, this here was incorrect. You know, the car was red rather than blue. Unfortunately, very often it's about your motives as a reporter, even from, you know, you get it, story selection. Why are you covering this when the bigger scandal is this? Or, you know, you're only writing this because, you know, well, even the story that we did today, which again was a pretty small one, I made the mistake of scrolling through Twitter, and a lot of people were saying that it was on behalf of the deep state, you know, who wanted to get Tulsi Gabbard out of office, et cetera. And it's, you know, wasn't. But I wish that we were engaging on the facts more than we were. Unfortunately, too much of the discourse is about the atmospherics rather than the facts. But yes, I think it's very, very worthwhile. Even all of that said, making a large factual error is costly in your career as whatever you're doing, and it's worth buttoning everything up before you press send.
I mean, beyond the making mistakes question, I do think, you know, if you're somebody with expertise in a certain subject, and, you know, you read an article and, you know, maybe you don't like the interpretation of it, or you think it was, or you just think there's another aspect of it that they didn't get into that they could have. Like, I always appreciate hearing from people about that. And if I love a good faith critique because I get so many bad faith ones that like when somebody comes to me and in a polite, friendly tone, constructive tone, you know, thinks they could offer something to my future reporting. Like, I always appreciate that, and there are people who have become regular sources of mine that way. And so I'd say whether you end up in think tanks or, you know, in the policy world, like, don't be afraid to reach out to reporters. I think we appreciate hearing from people who actually have something to offer for future reporting.
When you put something out into the void, it's good when the void yells back, I guess, no matter what. Like, at least you engaged with what I wrote.
Right, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
The void becomes like a person as opposed to just like a screaming mob.
Right, it's a good way to gauge the impact of it, to know that people are reading it and interacting with it, and that it's provoking some thoughts from them, and I think that makes our jobs easier and helps us do better work going forward.
I think it's about time to open up for some audience questions. Okay, we've got a mic there. I think y'all are coming around. Okay, it looks like we've got a question here. Great.
Thank you so much. My name is Lilith. I'm a recent graduate from University of Michigan. So I think Fergus touched upon a little what I'm going to ask about. It's about the safety and security of the journalist, but I'm curious to hear from everyone else. I was thinking, hearing you, how do you ensure the safety and security of your colleagues you work with, especially sometimes when it's in very, very sensitive topics with governments that not always love the work, or not only governments, but love the work that they do. So that is one aspect. And then also, what about the emotional and psychological security of people, especially in such a polarized media world that we live in? Yeah, thank you.
I can do a little bit the first. So on safety and security, the security of the information we take very seriously. I'll move to people in a second, but with information we're using encryption all the time. We use Signal, we use WhatsApp. Our own systems are attacked every time we do a project by China and Russia, typically, not always with them. And we repel them because we have an IT team that's really good at repelling. In terms of safety of reporters, that's a really difficult issue, and it's one that's getting exponentially worse. Typically what happens is the reporters leave the country, which is a really sad outcome. We've had one of our former colleagues, Matthew Caruana Galizia, his mum was blown up in Malta. Somebody that we didn't work with directly, but we worked with many of the people that he worked with. Jan Kuciak was shot dead with his girlfriend in Slovakia. As I said, our partners are routinely harassed, and so it's an ongoing problem, and there's a huge problem, and that's China. There's basically no Chinese reporters anymore. So in the way that there are news deserts here in America, say where local newspapers have collapsed as a consequence both of the collapse of funding for international through international aid for reporting. There's now news deserts in entire countries. The Ukraine, I think, because of the closure of USAID, has probably lost about 90% of its reporters. So there are, just very basically, people leave their countries. People work for with other news organizations within our orbit. We publish stories. If we can't publish a story in Ecuador, we'll publish in Bolivia to give protection to the people in Ecuador. We take people's names off stories. Sometimes we just did a story on transnational repression. Whilst we were doing the story on transnational repression, it was about China. We took several reporters' names off the stories because if it's too dangerous for them. We take huge cautions around the protections of sources. The absolute last thing we want to do is to have a source jailed. We did FinCEN Files, which was one of the biggest projects in the world. The source of that was BuzzFeed's source. Unfortunately, she did go to jail. So with every project, there's a range.
Protecting sources. This administration right now is talking a lot about going after leakers. And so I think all of us, when we have had sources, speak to us off the record or on deep background or whatever, on whatever terms, there's an implicit understanding that you will not reveal them under any circumstances. That's the general rule. We have not gotten to a point, I think, where this administration is, it has happened even under previous administrations where journalists are compelled to reveal their sources. That we've had conversations in our newsroom about, our legal team, our couple editors sat us down and said, you need to take this very seriously. Like the idea that if you're, you will stand behind the reporting and protect the source, and that is now suddenly a conversation that seems less hypothetical than it maybe did when I first started in journalism.
I'll take this. I don't have much to add on the physical safety to what Fergus said, but in terms of just sort of mental health and maintaining sort of emotional stability. I mean, I think an important, as particularly since COVID, so much has moved online, and so many newsrooms are effectively virtual now. I think that there's fewer of what you're saying, like the sort of personal interactions with colleagues, and I think being in a world where all you're dealing with are like names on a screen or even voices on a telephone, and not speaking to people, not just your sources, but colleagues, that when you encounter that kind of negativity online, it can take a greater toll on you. And so I hope that organizations sort of, not in a coercive way, but encourage real world interaction, and I think it's like healthy for their workforces. And I hope that journalists sort of seek out those too, as tempting as it is to just sit at home on your laptop and stare into the digital void all day.
One very quick bright spot on that, I will say, when I wrote a newsletter for several years for Axios, it came from my personal email. So and there was a little bit of personal touches to it, so people knew they were interacting with a human being rather than with a news institution. And I found that the incoming that I got directly from newsletter subscribers was 97% of it was either very kind or engaging seriously with the material. I think people a lot of times the negativity is coming at the idea of the media or whatever, but once you put a face to it, however you can, in some circumstances it's helpful.
Let's back in the back there. Oh, order. Sorry. Yeah. I'm gonna start calling people out by their shirt backwards or something.
Max Parnas. I work next door at AEI on Great Power Competition. One of the things that just came through in passing was members of the panel's own media consumption. I was just curious, I guess, aside from your own outlets, what are one or two things that you either read, watch, or listen to that are consistently really informative, or the format is very creative and interesting?
I'm not sure if this is going to help you, because I read everything about Australia because I lived there for a long time. I read everything about Ireland, and I read everything about America. So I'm constantly non-stop. So I read the Washington Post, the Guardian, the Belfast Telegraph. I listen to the Belfast Telegraph podcast, which is great, even if you know nothing about Belfast. So I'm just a news hog. I will just absorb news from everywhere.
One of my first jobs at FP was writing what at that point was called the Morning Brief newsletter, which was really just it was mostly a collection of links, and I'd get to write a little 2 or 3 paragraph thing up top. But you had to have 3 stories from every region. So I had to have 3 America stories, Africa. And I haven't done that in years, but I think that habit of that being the first way I consume news in the morning kind of stuck a little bit. So I tend to start just with wire services, I try to read the news before I go on Twitter and see what everybody's saying about it. So I think that's a useful exercise, and I think there's such a sometimes it's a little bit like little kids playing soccer. It's 10 people clustered around the ball. That's the way the media feels sometimes. It's everybody's chasing the new shiny object someday. So I think making an effort, if I haven't read anything about Africa in a while or Latin America, I sort of make a conscious effort to do that, because I do have a very generalist portfolio where I'm writing about foreign policy writ large. So that means if I'm not just going to be chasing the ball, I have to make a special effort to broaden it out. But in terms of I get a ton of newsletters now, including several from Axios. So that's maybe been the biggest change in the last couple of years, that I'm consuming a lot more news through my inbox than I used to.
Yeah, I'm a heavy podcast listener, as I mentioned before. I mean, I think my news diet to start the day is pretty traditional. I think lately the Journal has been getting a lot of stories that I'm saying, oh, I wish we had that. We wrote that one first. A couple of the real big newsrooms are, they have those reputations for a reason, and they're breaking a lot of news every day that's not necessarily breaking through because everybody's focused on LA and whatever else is happening. But if you want to find out what's happening in the national security space, you could do worse than starting with the Journal and the Times and the broadsheets. So I'll stick my hand up for mainstream media.
It's one other thing which these guys have reminded me of. Play with the algorithm. So you're being fed stuff, particularly on social media. You're like, it's not your. It's because you've looked at something before. It's giving you to again, yeah. And it won't change. If you say, for instance, if you're like comedians and you look at Nate Bargatze, you're going to get thousands of Nate Bargatze. You're not going to be able to escape Nate Bargatze, or he's going to come at you from everywhere: Facebook, Twitter, social, everything. He's going to come in. But if you play with the algorithm by indulging a different interest. So instead of Nate Bargatze, for instance, a comedian in South Africa, you'll get him, or her. And so that's it. Play with the algorithm, because the algorithm will corral you into something, and you can have a much richer life if you feud with it.
Yeah. And I think one of the dangerous aspects of that is it will give you news that you agree with as well, which I have found, even if it's a sports team that I follow or whatever, it'll be, it's not every side of the conversation. It's stuff that it thinks that you will agree with, which is unhealthy for our media ecosystem in general. But that's not a tip. That's just a depressing thought.
It helps a lot to just go to the actual website. I mean, it's like a very old-fashioned way now to consume media, but I find when I do that, I come across stories that I would never have found, because they just wouldn't be fed to me by my algorithm.
I think the idea of feuding with the algorithm is great. I'm going to think about that. Okay, let's white shirt in the back. Oh man, I want to feud with mine now.
First, thank you all so much for being here. You've each mentioned different developments that have been transformative in the journalism industry over the past, few decades, and I'm curious about your predictions for the next 5 to 10 years. How you imagine AI changing things, the transition of many writers at established institutions to Substack, just any predictions you have for these coming years.
The Substack effect ebbs and flows, I think. I think there was a conversation a few years ago that everybody was going to be their own brand, and the general media, the sort of big players in media wouldn't matter as much, and it turns out that it's very hard to make a sustainable business unless you're one of the 10 people with the biggest Substacks. I think that it turns out it's good to have a big news organization that will fund your reporting behind you in most cases, but I do think there is a real element of people finding ways to build their own personal brand rather than growing within the company they work for. I think in terms of AI, I'm borrowing this from our CEO who talks about this. He basically says that new information, you have to reveal genuinely new information in your reporting, because AI is not going to, if you have a behind the scenes of, what Trump said in a meeting about Iran, that it doesn't exist on the internet yet, AI is not going to replace that. Actual reporting, revealing information will be at a premium, as well as, really high level expertise where people want to go to you to know what you think of a particular development. So we have an economics correspondent named Neil Irwin who came to us from the Times, and people want to know when the Fed makes a decision, they want to know what does he think about it. So that's a good way to differentiate yourself from whatever ChatGPT is spitting out. But for those of us who are I spend most of my days editing these days, and ChatGPT is not great, but every once in a while will feed a story in there just to see what it would suggest, and it's getting better in real time. It's troubling to me a little bit. I don't think that editors are going to go away, but I think we will definitely be reckoning with AI as an industry over the next while, and I think it's going to be, especially for. Well, I don't want to monopolize the conversation about AI. Let's somebody else.
That's already kind of changed the way we do our jobs, I think. I mean, when I was working up here as an intern, then an editorial assistant, I mean, a big part of what I did was transcribing interviews. We would do a Q&A with some big important person, and they would give it to me to actually type out what something I say. So don't think that job exists anymore. And so, you know, that definitely like makes things faster for me. But, you know, I do wonder sometimes, like some of those early pathway, like first get you in the door newsroom jobs, like if some of those tasks are being automated away, I wonder what that sort of means for people trying to sort of get in the door. And, you know, it's more and more news. I mean, I probably shouldn't comment on it, but like Vox right now is in the midst of like labor negotiations between our union management, and a big topic of contention is over AI protections. And like we're not the first company that's dealt with that. There have been several cases of this. So I think it's we're still kind of like absorbing what the impact of that is for our jobs. But you know, I agree with what Dave said. I mean, I don't think it can replace unearthing new facts, putting the work in to do research, although I'm sure you're using those tools a lot more than you used to. And I don't think it, like personal voice and having, you know, wanting to know what like a certain person thinks or their interpretation of events. I mean, I think that's something that I hope at least there will still be a premium on.
We've all been through unimaginable changes in journalism in the last 20 years, 30 years. And I expect that that's going to speed up, and in 10 years it'll be unrecognizable. So it used to be that the person who could use a spreadsheet was the investigative reporter, and then it was the person who could use the special computer was the investigative reporter, and now anyone can be, you know, share information at the same time. It used to be that if you got a letter in the post with some information in it, you were excited. Now you get 12 million documents. So it's like journalism is unrecognizable from 10 years ago, and it'll be unrecognizable in 10 years from now. The AI it'll achieve wonderful things. It'll be amazing in many ways. So if I'll give you one small, tiny example. When we get 12 million documents, we have to identify people in it. AI can pull out passports. When you open an offshore account, you provide a passport or an electricity bill, it can pull out a passport. And if you have a passport, you're away, because if you have a passport, you know it's Vladimir Putin, not somebody else who's called Vladimir Putin. And that's a critical error. You don't want to get a milkman in Moscow into trouble, okay? So although we have previously found tattoo artists with $300 million in their accounts, so that's, you know, you never know what's going to happen. But so AI can transform things because it can pull out passports in seconds, which you would have taken weeks or months. So that's the transformation. But where it scares me is that we are already, for journalists, in a really precarious position where there are very few younger journalists, there are very few opportunities, there are very few local newspapers, local radio stations are closing down. And my concern is that AI will further decimate journalism, and that is not good for democracy.
Yeah. I think we got time for one more. You right there.
Hi, my name's Nate Neustadt. I work here in DC for an organization called Peaceworks. More on the topic of the AI conversation. With the rise of deepfakes and AI, especially in war and election reportings, how are you seeing that as negatively affecting your job and work life? And what are you as journalists doing to combat that so that the actual truth is getting out instead of all of these dis and misinformation campaigns taking over the mainstream media?
I'll just make one quick point. I think a lot of the stuff that's fooling people is not the super sophisticated stuff, unfortunately, at this point. Like a lot of the stuff that's spreading around, if you have, certainly if you're a professional journalist, but also if you have a degree of media literacy, you can probably recognize that a lot of the stuff that people are sharing is actually slop and is not real. And yet, you'll see the number of shares below it, and it'll blow your mind that this many people are consuming that information. So like, I am scared about the idea that this technology is going to get super, super sophisticated, and it'll be very hard, even for somebody who covers a conflict professionally, to know if this image is coming from the war that they spend their days covering. But at the moment, a lot of the stuff that I'm seeing fooling people is just like, you know, bad. And not, like that's one.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I can remember like the Twitter revolution, and the, you know, that phrasing being used, and this idea that like social media was, and it was for a long time. Like when the Arab Spring protests happened, it was an incredible resource to be able to sort of follow these events in real time the way we never had before. But, you know, trying this week to follow LA situation on social media is just like hopeless. Like just read the LA Times, don't, because you'll get AI slop, you'll get pictures from protests that happened 5 years ago. It's so it's much harder, I think, to like use those tools as just a way to follow the rules. And I'm worried too about malign actors kind of weaponize, because these models, these large language models, are only as good as the information that goes into them. And I think there's definitely, there's already reporting on, sort of Russian government operations trying to sort of seed AI models with their preferred narratives. And so I think we're going to see a lot more of that, of people trying to sort of weaponize these things. And I think we're all going to have to be pretty vigilant about it.
It's deeply concerning to us. Years ago, a couple of years ago, we got documents that were foundational documents for the Xinjiang internment camps. We spent months poring over them. We went to experts in Chinese characters, experts in stamps. We pulled out the names of people. We tracked to see if they were where they said they were at the time they were. Did they give a speech at the time they did? It was a ton of work, like a really absolute ton of work. And it does concern me that if people get better at doing fake documents, even that rigorous work, the kind of work that ICIJ pours a ton of time and effort into with our partners, may not be enough. Maybe we will be duped. I hope not.
Man, that's a note to end on. Well, I guess we're hoping that we're not doomed. I want to thank the three of y'all for a really interesting conversation and for being really frank about this and for engaging with sort of a broad sort of spectrum of questions that I think are essential for all of us. And I, for one, actually feel like the case for journalism feels really strong in this ecosystem. And so grateful to y'all for being here and for the work that you do.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Dave and Fergus. So we're now going to move into a quick 10-minute coffee break. We'll return here at 2:40 for our third panel on youth in Africa, which should be a great conversation. And that will lead into our keynote with Jake Sullivan. So thank you. We'll see you back here in 10 minutes.